So hi everybody, welcome to the seventh and final call in our series of little webinar conversations through the season of Lent. Thank you for joining us. If you've been with us throughout the series or if this is your first one, you're very welcome. I'm Gareth Higgins and I'm here with Brian McLaren and our special guest Mark Charles, and I'll hand over to Brian to start our call.
Well, for this last time in this season of Lent, we're coming together and we're lighting a candle as we begin, as a way of acknowledging that there's so much darkness in our world, there's so much darkness in our lives, and yet we are surrounded by light. We are surrounded by light. And in this week that we often call Holy Week, we watch the light of Christ shine first on Palm Sunday, and then through a series of encounters, conversations, disputes. On Thursday night, a gathering around a table, washing feet, sharing in bread and wine. On Friday, a crime, a murder. On Saturday, silence. And then on Sunday, an amazing revolutionary sense that the powers of violence, the powers of empire, did not in fact win. They were not in fact absolute, which opens up a whole new story that we are continuing to explore and seek to live by today. It's a pleasure to be with you both, and a pleasure to be with all who've joined us.
Thank you. So we're here to talk about the seventh story, and to recap how it became the seventh story is that there were six before then, and this is just a little hypothesis that Brian and I have been developing. It's one way of looking at the world. There's plenty of other ways of looking at the world. This one is helpful to us, and I know it's been helpful to some of you. The idea is really simple, that humans have developed six different stories or frameworks for making sense of our lives and trying to bring about peace and security. And I'll just summarize what those stories are. Maybe you recognize these from your own life. The first is the domination story, the idea that I will bring peace and security by ruling over you. The Roman Empire is a good example. The Empire in Star Wars is a good example. The way some people run their businesses, or even some people dominate their families. And of course, the whole question of colonialism and the way one group of people from one place would arrive in another place and seek to subdue, and that's a very generous term, the people who were already there. That's the domination story. The second story is what we call the revolution story, and that's I will get peace and security by overthrowing you, and then I'll rule over you. It might be slightly less bad than the domination story, but it's still violence, aggression, separation. The third story, the purification story, that's the story that says it's your fault, this group of people, because of what you believe or how you look or your gender or your sexual orientation or even what you wear or what you eat. And it's your fault. All our problems are your fault. And we scapegoat that group and exclude them or even exterminate them. And as I always say, assassination begins with character assassination. Or as an old friend of mine used to say, in order to be able to destroy the life of another, you have to turn them into a blank slate, because then it's easier to break the slate over your knee. That's the purification story. The fourth story, the isolation story, that's the story that says, I want to get away from all of you, from this world, and I'm going to go into the desert or the wilderness and find a promised land out there, build a utopian community. And we know from the history of utopian communities that are built on isolationism, they don't work. They very quickly devolve into domination stories vengeance-based revolution stories. The fifth story is what we call the victimization story. That's the story that says, my suffering is the most important thing about me. It's actually my very identity. What you did to me is the thing that matters most in my life. And I'm going to build my whole self on this thing I suffered. And if you try to take that away from me by suggesting that I might want to step back from vengeance or bitterness, I'm going to cause you to suffer too. Entire nations have been built on this story. That's the victimization story. And the sixth story is the accumulation story, which is the one that says, I'm just going to get more for myself, and that will bring peace and security, whether it's more furniture, a bigger house, or even invading a country. All of these stories are based on separation, humans from each other, humans from God and love, humans from Earth and the ecosystem. Another thing they have in common is that they don't work. Try them and you'll find out they don't bring about peace and security. Another important thing they have in common is that they are all based on an attempt at meeting a legitimate need. The need for safety, for security, for belonging is completely legitimate. Those six stories are just broken ways of getting those needs met. And the good news is that the seventh story addresses the legitimate need, but unlike the six stories, it actually meets those needs. So Brian, could you speak to what the seventh story is? And then we'll invite Mark to introduce himself and speak to this seventh story itself.
Well, the fact that we're in Holy Week, in a way, you see the seventh story as Jesus on Palm Sunday comes down the mountainside, overlooks Jerusalem, and begins to weep. And he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, if only you knew what makes for peace. In other words, you're running on these other stories and you don't know what makes for peace. And then he is going to model what makes for peace in the days to come through his teaching about the kingdom of God, through his weeping rather than planning revenge, through his messages of forgiveness and repentance, calling people to deep, deep change. And then on Holy Thursday, when he gathers people around a table, in a sense, rather than picturing the world as a war and we have to be winners or losers in it, he pictures creation as a meal, and we're companions, we're sharing together in a meal. He on Good Friday, as he is tried, he doesn't say, he didn't say on Thursday, my kingdom is of this world and so I'm going to fight. He says, my kingdom is a different kind of kingdom. It's not a violent kingdom. It doesn't win through violence. And on Good Friday, he demonstrates that by stretching out his arms in an embrace of love and compassion. And as he's dying, he doesn't say, God damn those murderers who did this to me. And even on Easter Sunday, when he rises, he doesn't say to his disciples, go get those bastards who did this to me. His words are, go into the world. We've got to preach a message of healing to bring us back into one family of mutual respect. And so that story, we could give it any number of names. Reconciliation or conciliation, liberation, harmony, love, and it's a different story to live by.
Thanks, Brian. And welcome, Mark, friend of ours who has recently moved to Washington, D.C. from the Navajo Reservation, a nationally known speaker, writer, and thinker, and someone who has taught me a lot. In fact, and I may say more about this if you want me to later on, Mark and I had a conversation 3 years ago, which literally changed my life and helped set me on a path toward some amazing gifts that I've received. as part of trying to pay more attention to the question of what reconciliation and liberation should look like in this society. So Mark, what else would you like to say about yourself by way of introduction?
Yeah, well, let me introduce myself. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure and honor to be on with both of you. Yate, Mark Charles Yunishia, Sin Bakadana Nishma, Dota Glini Bashis Chin, Sin Bakadana Bashiche, Dota Chitni Bashinala. And among our Navajo people, whenever we introduce ourselves, we always give our 4 clans. We're a matrilineal people, and our identities come from our mother's mother. So my mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, which is why I say Sin Bakadana. That translates into I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my mother's father, or my father's mother, is Toahaglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsinbake. Then my fourth clan, my father's father, is Totachitni, and that's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. And so I moved to DC. My wife and our 3 children, we moved here about 4 years ago. We were living on the Navajo reservation for over 11 years. Our children were born there and raised there. And through some work I was doing and the call of Creator, we decided to uproot ourselves and come out here to DC and to see what difference we can make on a bit more of a national level. So I've been engaging in issues of both historical analysis and theological work, and really trying to find how do we bring some healing out of this mess that we have, both as a church as well as a nation. And so I'm really looking for ways to bring some deeper healing on a very corporate level that I see as a hurt and the separation, the pain that exists both within the church as well as in our country as a whole.
Thank you. So, reconciliation and liberation. What do those words mean to you?
So, probably the best way to even help people understand how I frame this conversation is to share a little bit of my story. About 15 years ago, I was the pastor of a church in Denver, Colorado called the Christian Indian Center. And my congregation that I was working with was wrestling with the question of what does it mean to be Navajo and be Christian? A lot of our members and a lot of our tribe are boarding school survivors. And in the boarding schools, which were run by both the churches and the state, literally the Navajo-ness, the Navajo culture, language, understanding what's sacred was beaten out of our people so that they could become American and then eventually assimilate and even become a Christian. The goal of the boarding schools was to kill the Indian to save the man. And so because of that, there are a lot of Christians on our reservation, but many of them are very, very assimilated and do not use our culture and our language in our worship. So our congregation was wrestling with that and trying to find a path to begin to incorporate that into our teaching. And I'd grown up near our reservation. My grandparents on my father's side were both raised traditionally, but then through the boarding school, my grandmother became a Christian, and my grandfather later in life became a Christian. And they worked with some of the early missionaries and very much bought into this understanding of to be Christian meant to be American. So they didn't teach the language to my father, so he didn't know what to teach it to me. We didn't grow up with the traditions in our family. But we lived on a border town to the reservation and still very connected to our Navajo culture and our people, just not participating in it. And so as I was leading this dialogue in our church, or tasked with leading this dialogue, I realized that I had a lot of shortcomings in that I had not grown up with my traditional culture. So after 2 years, we decided that I should move back to the reservation to basically experience what it is that my people have gone through. Mm-hmm. And so we moved back. We wanted to live in one of the more traditional areas of our reservation. And one of the families in the church I was pastoring had a hogan, a sheep camp. in the middle of the reservation. It was 6 miles off the nearest paved road on a dirt road. There were no running water, no electricity. The neighbors we had on the sheep camp with us were shepherds and rug weavers. And we moved into this place to basically experience how most of my generation grew up, or at least spent their summers, and how most of my parents and grandparents grew up living their lives. And we moved there prepared to be off the grid, prepared to haul our water, live by candlelight, cook over a fire or a camp stove. But what caught us completely by surprise when we got there was how completely marginalized we felt. Literally felt like we dropped off the face of the earth. And I didn't know what to do. I was completely unexpected to me. I quickly learned that the only non-natives who come to reservation, or the primary group of non-natives who come to reservations, are those who come to take our picture, or those who come to give us charity. And nobody was interested in getting to know us. And I was wrestling through this. I was becoming more and more insecure about who I was and where I was living. I was becoming more and more angry as I was experiencing this marginalization and understanding more of the history. And I was trying to talk with my non-native friends about it over the phone, again, because they weren't coming to the reservation, or even over email. But every time we'd get into a discussion, eventually it would become so heated and I would become so emotionally angered that I'd have to either hang up the phone or I would start yelling at them. And so I learned to kind of temper myself and disconnect and talk like I was reading a newspaper story or something I was not personally involved with. And I could stay in the dialogue longer, but then it wasn't long before my friends would begin to become ashamed or become defensive, and soon they would drop out of the dialogue. And I did not know how to get this dialogue forward without one or both of us screaming at each other or hanging our heads in shame and walking out of the dialogue. So one day I was writing a letter to a group of friends. It was like the 10th time or 5th time I was trying to explain to him how it felt to live on the reservation and still understand I was a citizen of this country. And I said to them, it feels like living on the reservation and yet being an American citizen, it feels like my native people, or Navajo people, native peoples, are this old grandmother who has a very large and a very beautiful house. And years ago, some people came into our house and they locked us upstairs in the bedroom. Today, our house is full of people. They're sitting on our furniture, they're eating our food, they're having a party inside our house. Now, they've since come upstairs and they've unlocked the door to our bedroom, but it's much later, and we're tired, we're old, we're weak, or we're sick, so we can't or we don't come out. But the thing that hurts us the most, what causes us the most pain, is that virtually nobody from this party ever comes upstairs, seeks out the grandmother in the bedroom, sits down next to her on the bed, takes her hand, and simply says, "Thank you. Thank you for letting us be in your house." I wrote that, and immediately I was like, that's it. That's how I feel. I started sharing that with some of my neighbors and people in our community, and several people told me, I've lived here all my life. I've never known how to articulate how it feels, and you hit the nail on the head. I began sharing that with non-native peoples. And now, instead of them getting defensive or me getting angry, they were coming up to me and after hearing this metaphor and saying, how do I say thank you? How does my family, my community, my church, my city, even my nation express gratitude to the indigenous hosts of this land? And I knew I was onto something, because the biggest challenge I was facing was there was no dialogue, there was no conversation. And when I tried to express how it felt, I would become angry and start screaming. Or if I was able to temper myself, the people who were hearing my words, eventually they would become so ashamed and so frustrated that they would drop out. And I had no idea how to move the dialogue forward. And I found that metaphor changed the conversation, because now, instead of talking about victim and oppressor, now instead of talking about the horrible things that happen, what we ended up framing the dialogue as is, what happened to this reversal of roles? And this is what I like to point out is, you know, that's what this metaphor does, is it highlights that there's been a reversal of roles in this country. We have 300+ million people, the majority of them who are white, and they're living here acting like they own the place. And we have 6 million indigenous peoples acting like we're unwanted guests in someone else's house. And if we're going to move this conversation forward, we have to find a way to reverse these roles. We have to find a way to get the 350 million, not just the white Americans, but everyone else except for African Americans who were brought over here as slaves, but everyone else who has immigrated here without following protocol, without getting the permission of the host people of the land, undocumented immigration, if you will, beginning with Columbus. And actually that wasn't immigration, that was colonization, but over the years it's turned into immigration. And acting like they own the place. And I found that using this metaphor framed the dialogue differently. And it didn't focus on victimization or even necessarily on oppression, but it framed the dialogue in a question of how can we reverse those roles? How can we get 300 million to understand in some very real and practical ways they are guests in someone else's house? And how can we encourage, exhort, invite our indigenous peoples to act and step into our role as the host people of the land? And I found that framing the dialogue in that way, it gets me so much further down the road in the conversation than I ever got when I was talking about the victim versus oppressor. And I would have people come up and say, what does it look like to say thank you? See, now we're having a very different dialogue, not an easier dialogue, but a very different dialogue, and one that actually creates space for people to participate in it. And so that was kind of the beginning of my journey of the work that I'm doing, of trying to figure out how can we frame this conversation so that we can actually get to a better place. Because the way we've been framing it for the past, whether it's 500 years since Columbus or 250+ years since the founding of the nation, that we've been framing it in a way that either minimizes the voice of those who have been marginalized, or it just it completely excludes the people who have done the oppressing and creates no space for them to be involved. And by framing it through this metaphor, it realigns the roles and creates a space for us to actually have a conversation. You know, there's a native leader from Alaska. He's from the Dene people in in Canada. His name is George Erasmus. And he says, where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want to build community, he says, you need to start by creating a common memory. And I think that quote is brilliant and gets to the heart of our nation's problem with race, which is we don't have a common memory. We have a majority, a white majority primarily, but many other minorities will fall into that majority belief. There's this narrative of this memory of discovery and expansion and opportunity and exceptionalism. And then you have communities of color, primarily starting with Native Americans and African Americans, but also including other minorities as they've come into this nation, where we have the very lived experience of stolen lands, broken treaties, slavery, Jim Crow laws, mass incarceration, internment camps, exclusionary acts, families separated at borders, boarding schools. There's no common memory. I think everyone, as I've traveled the nation, can agree that over the past 15, 20 years, and maybe even longer, community is at an all-time low in our nation. We can't even talk to people who believe or think differently than us, especially politically. And race relations have gotten even worse. And so what I'm really trying to do is by reframing the dialogue as a reversal of roles, what it does is it creates space and it allows us to explore different ways of moving the conversation forward. And that's what it's all about. Every other way we try to move it forward has been blocked. The furthest we probably got was through the civil rights movement, but even that has severe limitations and has met many challenges. And every other way we've tried to do it just has, as you share in the 7 stories, the nation has tried all of these ways to bring about some sort of healing and some sort of community in this country, and it has not worked. And so we have to find a way to move the conversation forward that doesn't rely on any of the from the previous 6 stories that you very well articulated in this book.
So, Mark, what's the first step that a non-native person hearing you should take? Or what's the first step you want them to take?
So what I try to do in almost all of my teaching and all of the work I'm doing, I'm writing a book right now. We have a book coming out in a few weeks. My co-author, Sing-Chan Ra, and I are writing a book on the doctrine of discovery. It's called Unsettling Truths. And I've been lecturing on this doctrine for many years. There's many great native leaders who are doing similar work, Steve Newcomb and others who are trying to raise the issue of the doctrine of discovery and what it's done. And one of the things that I'm trying to do is to change people's paradigm and how they think about what it means to be an American citizen. An example of this is I was out, this was several years ago, probably over a decade ago, I was herding sheep with one of my neighbors on the sheep camp where we lived out on the reservation in this one-room hogan. And we were herding sheep one day, and this gentleman I was with was a boarding school survivor. He speaks better Navajo than English. He's lived on the reservation the majority of his life. And we're walking through the fields. This is early 2000s. President Bush has just come into office. And there's dialogue about immigration reform. And I said to my friend, I said, you know, the nation's talking about immigration reform. I'm curious what your opinion is. What do you think we should do? He said, well, there's already so many of them here that maybe we shouldn't worry about borders anymore. Maybe we should not worry about those things anymore. Now, if you're anywhere else, you're assuming he's talking about the 14 million who have come over the southern border and are undocumented. But because we're on the reservation, because we're both Navajo, because he's a boarding school survivor, you have to pause and ask, is he talking about the 14 million or the 300 million? And the ambiguity was so golden, I just left it. I didn't even ask him to clarify. And I began teaching and writing it after that point, telling people that without natives at the table, our nation is incapable of comprehensively and justly reforming immigration law. You know, we talk about the fact as a nation, people will say this all the time, that we are a nation of immigrants. That's not true. The only way we are a nation of immigrants is if you disregard and dehumanize African Americans whose ancestors were brought here forcibly as slaves, and Native Americans who are indigenous to this land. Just by saying that we're a nation of immigrants requires dehumanizing and disregarding two groups of people that this nation was founded on the oppression of. And so I'm trying very hard to reframe the dialogue. You know, several years ago, I was asked after President Obama went to Alaska and renamed Mount McKinley back to Denali. And I was asked by Sojourners, actually, if I could write an article about how significant this renaming was for Native peoples. I agreed to write the article, but the article I gave them was how significant this renaming was for white people. What I said is, you know, Mount Denali for the Athabascan people, this has been their mountain for eons. It's a part of their creation story. When a prospector came out a while ago, and a white prospector, and heard that McKinley had been nominated as a Republican nominee for president and celebrated by renaming this mountain after this man who's never even been to it, and that name stuck. Beginning from that point, the Denali people, the Athabascan people in Alaska began fighting to keep the name Denali. And so when President Obama came back to rename it, he wasn't doing something, he was just agreeing with what the Athabascan people already were advocating for. They wanted this nation to call this mountain by their sacred name. Now think about that. If you had been colonized by a group of people and subjugated under them and oppressed by them, and your land was stolen by them, why would you want to share with this nation the holy, sacred name of the mountain that's in your creation story? There's one easy argument that says, we don't even want them. They don't understand this history. They don't understand this story. They have no respect for this land. They're not living here properly. They don't have the right. They don't get the privilege. They don't get the honor of calling this mountain by our sacred name. Mm-hmm. So fine, let them in their ignorance and blindness call it Mount McKinley. We're going to keep Mount Denali for ourselves because we know the story of this mountain. But they didn't say that. They said, no, we want this nation to call this Mount Denali. We want to share a piece of our sacred creation story with these colonial, undocumented immigrants who have come here. They've left everything they've known, everything they understood. They've left their own creation stories, and they've come here seeking some kind of promise of prosperity. They have no idea why the mountains lie where they lie, no idea why the rivers flow where they flow, and as a result, they live here like they're living in a hotel room. But we want to share this name of our mountain with them. Maybe even to begin teaching them what it means to live here respectfully. Maybe even to share a bit of our connection to this land. That's an amazing gift. Mm-hmm. That's an amazing gift. This wasn't about what Obama did for Native peoples. This is about what the Athabascan people did for this nation. See, the problem is we completely reframe the dialogue. We've been so led to believe that Americans, white Americans, are exceptional and superior, and everyone else is just grateful and lucky to be able to associate with them. That how great that this white colonial nation has allowed its indigenous peoples to call the mountain by their traditional name. No, that's not the story at all. What an amazing gift of the indigenous peoples of this land that they would give this colonial genocidal nation the permission, the right, the honor of calling this mountain by their sacred traditional name.
Part of what I think is incumbent upon white people is to pause and listen, which is why I'm not going to immediately give you a follow-up question. But to say thank you for carrying the burden that you carry and doing the, let's call it, necessary but unjust work of educating people like us. And we want to listen and play our own part in educating ourselves. So I don't have a follow-up question.
Yeah.
And what I do want to do is to let settle what you've said and move to our the way we wrap up these calls with these questions about our own personal experiences. But before we shift to that, Brian, is there anything you want to add at this point?
Well, I just want to say, echo those words of thanks to Mark. And Mark, those two stories that you told, first the story about the grandmother locked in the attic, and then this, which is in a way a kind of parable, and then this historic story of the recovery of the name of that mountain and the complexity of the relationships involved. They really are both ways of telling this seventh story that this week, millions of people around the world, I'm sad to say, will miss, because they will frame the story of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection within the confines of that kind of white Christendom narrative. They'll use words like Christ being victorious without realizing how that word victorious sneaks in to justify centuries and centuries of domination. And so you've given all of us a gift by telling these other stories that maybe will help us see the stories of Maundy Thursday and Good Friday and Holy Saturday and Easter Sunday in a fresh way. An invitation from the Spirit of God to step out of those other 6 destructive stories into this story of good news. So thank you.
Very welcome.
So let's do a quick round of porch questions. Starting with we'll start with me, go to Brian, and then go to Mark. What's life-giving? What's one life-giving thing? And just so you know, those of you who are listening, the first 2 of these questions, which are what's life-giving and what's challenging, they're kind of modern reinterpretations of what's known as the Ignatian spiritual exercises, which use this florid language of what are the sources of consolation in your life and what are the sources of desolation. And that really just means what's bringing you life and what's challenging or draining you. So for me, what's life-giving, I'm having a life-giving experience at the moment in that folks who've just come to our new Story Festival, lots of them are telling us that they had a wonderful experience at it. And why that's life-giving to me is I'm on the inside of it and I sort of see how the sausage is made, as they say. And so I see all the things that, could have been better or the infrastructure issues and so on and so forth. But the folk who came on the whole had a beautiful experience. And I liken it to what I call the first violinist's problem, which is if you're watching an orchestra play from the audience, you hear the whole orchestra. The first violinist hears the mistakes that they made or the thing they could have done better. But when you're watching the whole orchestra and it's functioning with integrity, it doesn't have to be perfect in order to be beautiful. So I'm being reminded that sometimes when you just do a diligent job or you try to act with integrity, you have no control over the outcome at all, and often beautiful things are happening that I don't even see. So that's giving me a boost at the start of this week. What about you, Brian? What's life-giving for you?
I was out on my kayak for a few hours yesterday in the Everglades, and there's a bird that I just love. It's called the swallow-tailed kite, and I got to see 3 of them and just sit in my kayak in the water, watching them gracefully soar. And I just feel like every time I see one, it fills me up.
Thank you. Mark, what's life-giving for you?
So in the past 2 months, I've had the joy of driving across the country with my children. My wife's parents gave our son a car for his graduation. He's a senior this year, and he's going to school in California. And he's actually now on a 3-month road trip. traveling up the Pacific coast, mountain biking. He's driving, but he's mountain biking and camping and staying with friends and flying his drone in national parks and enjoying the beauty of creation. And but we had to get his car registered in DC. So 2 months ago, I flew out to California with my daughters, and we picked up the car from my wife's parents, my mother and father-in-law. And my daughters and I drove it all the way from LA back to DC and had 4 days in the car together, 5 days in the car together, and just had a great time. And then my son, going on his trip, he had to drive back, and I wanted to make sure he was comfortable driving long distances. And so I drove with him from DC back to Gallup, New Mexico. So we just spent 3 days in the car together. And yeah, I-40 from Tennessee to New Mexico is a long drive, almost a couple thousand miles. But the time to spend in the car with my children and just talking and hanging out and even just riding in silence, but then having some more deep dialogue, that was so life-giving. It was such a blessing. And yeah, I'm very, very grateful I've had the chance to do that with all three of my kids just in the past 2 months.
Mm-hmm. So the next question is, what's something that's challenging to you at the moment? And I'll go first again this time. And it's a variation of something I've said on most of these calls. And it's to do with the bombardment of information, propaganda, polemics, anger that's in the world today. I'm not sure. I'm always asking myself, where am I in relation to all this information? Some of it's factual, some of it's not factual. Some of it's helpful, some of it's not helpful. And I'm always trying to ask myself, how do I find some grounding in the midst of this swirl that seems so loud and so bombardment is the word. And I continue to work on some practices to get there. And the best part of it is about faith doesn't necessarily have anything to do with what the news says is going on, but I often can get overwhelmed by the bleakness of those stories out there. Brian.
Well, you know, I have a lot on my plate right now, all creative projects, all that I love. And I actually really enjoy each of them. But what happens is, because there's so many different projects, in my imagination, they tend to get bigger. And then I just feel like it's too much. It's not really too much, but I keep turning them into too much. So that's probably where I lose some energy.
Thanks. Mark, what about you?
I live in DC. And the challenge with living in DC is you can't escape the political dialogue. And what I found most challenging, and I don't have time to go into all of this in depth, is the narrative that's been coming out in the past probably year. You know, when our nation elected Donald Trump, President Trump, a majority of I actually tell people that election made my job easier, because it was easier to convince people we have a problem in our country. Mm-hmm. But as 2017 turned into 2018, we got closer and closer to the midterm elections. The narrative coming out of the Democratic Party was, put us back in power and we'll fix the problems. Now, when you understand the doctrine of discovery, you understand the deep systemic foundational problems we have as a nation. You understand how, I mean, one of the things I can just mention here, the doctrine of discovery was referenced in a Supreme Court case as recently as 2005. One of the most white supremacist Supreme Court rulings written in my lifetime. And it was authored by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. You know, when you see these things, you understand the foundational problem. White supremacy, racism, sexism, these are bipartisan values. the left isn't going to fix it any quicker than the right is. And so the challenge I've been having as we've come into this last election cycle, 2018, and now going into a presidential election cycle, is this partisan bickering of each side demonizing each other and each side convinced that they are going to be able to fix the problem. And I'm trying in my work to get people to understand we're not talking about partisan issues here. We're talking about things both parties agree on, which is white supremacy, the heresy of Christian empire, and sexism. Parties agree on these things. One's just explicit, the other's implicit, but they absolutely agree. And until we recognize that these are foundational problems, we're never going to fix them. So my biggest challenge in the past 6 months has been dealing with liberal Christians to get them to understand that the Democratic Party is not going to solve our nation's problems. It's easy to convince, it's easy to point out how the right has completely gone off the rails. It's harder to convince the left that they don't have the solution. And then, therefore, to create this new dialogue, which actually deals with the roots of the problem and not just the fruits that's hanging to the left or to the right.
So we have a third question, which I'll just name so that those of you listening can be thinking about this one, and that's about your sense of purpose and calling for the common good, and how it's showing up in your life. And I think this whole call has been both about, Mark, what you are leading us into, and what Brian and I, as white men, one of us born here in the US and one of us more recently immigrated, what the challenge and invitation to us is. And the fourth question we ask is, how can we help each other? And my response to that is I want to continue to deepen the listening and the relationships that I have with Native people. As you know, Mark, you kind of offered me a helpful inspiration and a challenge 3 years ago around meeting local Native people where I am, and that's the thing I would encourage. If anybody listening to this, particularly, if you're a non-Native person, and if you're not a descendant of Africans who were brought here in chains, because I think the responsibilities are different for white people particularly. If you want help to participate in what Mark is challenging you to, I would ask you to contact me first, rather than ask people like Mark to do the work for you. I know, Mark, you're an educator and a leader and a pioneer. And I want to encourage people to listen to you and to read what you have to say. But if you're a white person and you want some help on this, I'd be glad to hear from you and help advise you on 1 or 2 steps. And the primary step I would encourage you, if you live somewhere on Turtle Island, if you live somewhere in North America, you are near some people who are indigenous to this land. And you can look them up in the phone book. There are tribes, there are education officers. Tribes often have an education officer who's an ideal person. If you literally don't know any Native people, start with the education officer at your local tribe. But I encourage you to actually go there and go to the museum, go to the places where Native people are with sensitivity and respect, and ask for a conversation. And I'm happy to help anybody learn from the little bit that I've learned from people like Mark. And before him, someone I want to acknowledge is a man who has passed on and whom we love and respect, and that's Richard Twiss, who sort of started my journey in thinking about these things. So that's the help I want to offer. If anybody out there listening wants to take this further, please feel free to contact me through the7thstory.com. Brian or Mark, do you want to speak to anything about the help you need or the help you want to offer?
I think we'll I'll just say, just want to keep up in this work of listening and sharing and opening up space.
Mark, have you any closing words you want to share with us, knowing that this is the end of our 7-week Lent series, and you've come in to give us some really substantial, powerful food for thought?
So, coming off of this quote by George Erasmus about creating common memory and trying to find a way to move the racial dialogue forward in our nation, over the years, I've become convinced, and you can go on my website at wirelesshogan.com. I have lectures, I have articles, I have blogs, I have resources I've done on the Doctrine of Discovery. You can get our book that's coming out in October. But I've become convinced the United States of America needs a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. A conversation I would put on par with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that took place in South Africa, in Rwanda, and in Canada. I would call ours Truth and Conciliation, because reconciliation implies there was a previous harmony, and if you understand our history, that just isn't the case here. And I think we need it sooner rather than later. My goal is 2021. So I am literally doing everything I can right now to bring this dialogue to a more national level. And I'm trying to engage our nation. So we've been bickering as a nation, especially in the past 4 years, about how great we are and or when we can be great again. And no one is able to acknowledge that if you read our foundations, we the people doesn't mean all the people. And this is the question I'm trying to pose to our country is, do we even want to be a nation where we the people means all the people? I'm not convinced we do. If we want to, we have to do something about land titles. If we want to, we have to do something about the wording of our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence, which excludes anyone who's not white, landowning, and male. We have some deep, deep foundational work if we really want to be a nation where we the people actually means all the people. And this is the conversation I'm trying hard to initiate around the country. And I'm doing it through my writing, I'm doing it through my speaking, I'm doing it through a lot of other ways. But this is the conversation I think we have to have in our country. And the church has a role in that as well, because the church wrote the Doctrine of Discovery. The church is at the foundation of has justified most of what our nation has done. And so the church has a role in cleaning up this mess. Probably not the role most Christians think it should have, but it does have a role. And yeah, this is literally the work I'm trying to do. So I invite people to watch my social media. You can find me online, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook. Wireless Hogan is my username pretty much everywhere. Follow my blog, check out my website. And I invite you to join in this dialogue that I think we need to have as a country, which is, do we want to be a nation where we the people finally means all the people? If we do, then we have some pretty tough choices we have to make and some very foundational level changes we have to enact. If we don't, then we have to learn to embrace who we are, which is not going to be pretty. So anyway, so that's what I'm working on, and that's what I'm really trying to invest in with everything I have right now, is trying to move this conversation forward.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah.
Well, our time is up. If a story came into the world that invited us to think about a we the people that included all the people, and then people decided, no, we don't want that story, and they extinguished the voice of the person who was bringing the story. The question is, would each of us present the little wick of our lives to let that light be in us? I think that's a benediction for this Holy Week and for this season of Lent. Thank you so much to Mark and all the other guests who've been with us over these weeks. And thank you, Gareth, and thanks to all who've joined us. God bless you.
Amen.